Salve, my Quickclassics friends. Welcome back to the Quickclassics series. I thought that this would be kind of a fun segue into a series that I'm about to do on ancient Aegean civilization. But today we're going to take a brief little look at the real hero, archaeological hero of the discovery of Troy, and that's not Heinrich Schliemann, as you might suspect, but is in fact Frank Calvert. Now, many of you, of course, will be familiar with Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and these are, in fact, mythologized accounts of events that actually did take place around 1200 BC. Homer is writing at the end of the Greek Dark Age, and so this is a number of centuries after uh, these events have transpired, but they made such an impression on the cultural memory of the Greek speaking peoples that it became part and parcel of their literature, their literary, growing literary tradition at that time. But archaeology has confirmed that this was the case, and we also have contemporary records that the Hittites kept, which in fact detail names and places that are mentioned in specifically the Iliad, places like Ilios and the city of Troy, and people's names, prominent people's names, such as King Priam of Troy, Agamemnon, the Achaeans, which was the name of the Greek confederacy, the Mycenaean confederacy. And so there was this war that took place between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Trojans of Western Turkey, ancient Turkey, over control of uh, the Aegean Sea, and more specifically, over control of the money and the shipping lanes and things of that nature. Now, all of this takes place in the wake of the downfall of Minoan civilization. And once the Minoans were no longer the dominant maritime force in that part of the Mediterranean, uh, control over it uh, went to the Mycenaeans for a while, but the Trojans, of course, wanted in on the action too, and they went to war over it. Of course, the reason for the war in Homer's epics is because of Helen of Sparta. Um, there may be something there about a botched political marriage uh, at the heart of all this. We don't know that for sure, um, but the real reasons for the war seem to be um, economic, which coincidentally is often the root of most wars that are fought. Now, in any discussion of the history of the archaeology of Troy, Schliemann, that is Heinrich Schliemann's name, figures prominently. He's usually given the bulk of the credit, if not all of the credit. Now, I can think back to my own classes on the introduction of archaeology, even some of my graduate seminars, in any discussion of the antiquities of Western Turkey or the Greek world. Schliemann's name always came very much to the fore, and you didn't hear anything about this guy, Frank Calvert. Schliemann was a German merchant who, once he made his fortune, set out to find the historical Troy, the location of Troy. He was not an archaeologist. He was not trained in field methods. He was a sort of a self-educated classicist. And really, the only thing that he was going on was the Homeric literature. It's arguable that he would not have even known where to look in the end, other than the general parameters of Western Turkey, had it not been for a chance encounter at a dinner with Frank Calvert. Calvert was a field archaeologist of some years standing. He was the recognized authority on the antiquities of that part of Turkey, the Troad. Um, He worked for the British consulate, and he actually owned land on which the hill of Hisarlik, which would later bear out to be the location of the historical Troy. He actually owned this land, and eventually would, of course, collaborate with Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann, unfortunately, was more like the P.T. Barnum of early archaeology, and whereas Calvert was the field archaeologist, Schliemann paid no attention to provenience, little care for stratigraphy. He would trench through these mounds without any care for what archaeologists that have been trained in the last century would be trained to pay attention to, not just artifacts, but their location within the stratigraphic record. And he often would go behind Calvert's back and either not get the proper permits through the antiquities department in Turkey, or not abide by the ones that are standing. And so Calvert had to, I'm sure, politically mitigate a lot of that. But what's interesting and also sad about this is that, once again, Calvert doesn't get a whole lot of credit. It's only been within the last 10 or 20 years or so that Calvert has really gotten the credit that he's due, largely because of his family's efforts to make sure that he had his proper place, his niche in the history of archaeology, and his role in discovering Troy. Unfortunately, this sometimes happens in the history of the infancy of archaeology, is that you get these personalities like Schliemann who sensationalize everything. And I did a review a number of years ago on the accounts in especially the American press of the day and some of the Western European press about the coverage of the sites that Schliemann was working on, including Mycenae and Troy. And very rarely do you read any mention of Calvert or his very significant role, we know now, in the excavation and bringing to light of the antiquities of Troy. So, as I say, it's unfortunate that these sorts of things happen in the early days of archaeology, but we have to remember too that a lot of the personalities like Schliemann had no concern for the cultural connection of these antiquities to the lands. There was no sense of cultural resource management like we have in archaeology today. So I would put forward that Schliemann, committed some pretty heinous archaeological crimes, and that Calvert did what he could to mitigate them. All right, like I said, I hope that you learned something new about Calvert and even Schliemann. I'll put links in the description so that you can look into both of these fellows, especially Calvert. And this will be a fun base from which to jump into our discussion about ancient Aegean civilization. And I'll keep you apprised on that. Should be coming up here next week. All right, Godspeed, my friends. Remember, if you like the content, click a like, subscribe, and feel free to share as well. Have a good evening.